Good afternoon, everyone. How are you all doing today? Doing well? There's some room up front, so if you want to come on up, there's some couch space, there's some chairs, so, feel free. Really excited to welcome Hannah Garry for our third What Matters to Me and Why of this semester. I'm really grateful to all of you for coming. And if you're here, just happen to be here, grab some food and join us, please. Before we begin, I want to make a few quick announcements. Today is an auspicious day. It's the 15th anniversary of the release of maybe my favorite movie, The Big Lebowski. Has anyone seen it? Yeah, it's a great movie. It's a great LA movie, and it's a great spiritual sort of quasi-Zen Buddhist movie. So in celebration of that, I suggest you all go out and see it if you haven't. There's a Lebowski festival that's happening this weekend in Los Angeles. But some upcoming events. We're hosting Rob Bell on March 26th at 6 p.m. at the RTCC Ballroom. Many of you may know Rob Bell. He's one of the most prominent evangelical pastors in the country. He was recently on the cover of Newsweek magazine. He's going to speak about his new book called What We Talk About When We Talk About God. I think he's really one of the most important young religious leaders in the country. So I encourage you all to come see him speak. That's March 26th at 6 p.m. You can RSVP at USC Spectrum, and it's free and open to the public. And next week, on Tuesday, March 12th at 12:30 p.m., at Room 7 in the Law School, we're going to have our Spirit of the Law series, and we're going to welcome the Dean of the Law School, Dean Robert Rasmussen. That's at 12:30, free and open to the public, free lunch. It's a series that's really based on what matters to me and why. It's a student-run series at the law school where we bring in different legal professionals and scholars to talk about how they find meaning and purpose in their life as lawyers, which is something I thought about often in my life, how they use their law degree in creative and innovative ways, and how they connect the personal and the professional in their life. And we're really grateful I'm very grateful today to have the president of the Spirit of the Law group here today, Jennifer Park, who will introduce our speaker today. So please join me in welcoming Jennifer.
Thank you, Dean Soni, and hello, everyone. Today, I have the privilege of introducing Professor Hannah Garry, a distinguished legal scholar and passionate advocate for international human rights. Although I have not personally had the pleasure of studying under Professor Garry, her presence is deeply felt at the law school, where she brings awareness and attention to the important issues of international human rights. Professor Garry is director of the USC Law's International Human Rights Clinic, and she specializes in international human rights law, international criminal law, international humanitarian law, and international refugee law. Professor Garry's impressive resume spans 4 continents and many prestigious academic institutions. Professor Garry holds a JD from Berkeley Law, a master's in international affairs from Columbia, and a graduate certificate in forced migration studies from Oxford. Since 1994, Professor Garry has worked on international human rights and international criminal laws in Africa, Asia, and Europe with various international human rights organizations. Specifically, as a research consultant at Oxford and a university in Uganda, she implemented a research project on the protection of refugee rights in Uganda and Kenya. She was also a visiting lecturer at Peking University in Beijing, a visiting scholar at the European Court of Human Rights in France, and visiting faculty at the University of Colorado Law School. And most recently, in 2011 and until 2012, Professor Garry was a legal advisor to the Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia, as well as a legal officer and deputy chief to cabinet in the Appeals Chamber and Office of the President of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. So please join me today in welcoming Professor Garry as she explains why she's committed her life to these important issues.
Well, thanks, Jennifer, for that wonderful introduction, and thanks to Dean Soni for the invitation today to join you all, and thanks to each of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to sit and chat with me and dialogue with me today about what matters to me and why. I think it's wonderful to join a group that wants to talk about these bigger questions, and I'm very honored that you want to talk about them with me. And I really appreciate today the opportunity to just step back a bit and reflect. As a law professor at the law school here at USC and as director of the Human Rights Clinic, I ask my students, I actually make them write papers about their goals and reflect on what motivates them to do human rights work. And so I'm grateful for the opportunity today to actually have to practice what I require them to do and to step back and reflect on what matters to me and why. So in thinking about these two questions, you know, I stopped and I thought, well, there are many things that matter to me, but what I want to focus on today is one of the things that matters to me most and to which I've dedicated a good portion of my adult life anyway, and that is to my chosen profession and career as a teacher, as an advocate, and a scholar on respect for human rights. What matters to me is working towards the realization or enforcement of the fact that all individuals and groups of individuals, no matter what their background, no matter their race, their religion, their political beliefs, their social group, their economic class, their gender, their sexual orientation, they're all equally entitled to basic rights. And in fact, this is inherent in what it means to be human. That's by definition, to be human is to have these rights. And so what really matters to me in my profession is working for this basic humanity as our modus operandi in the world today. So in reflecting on why this matters to me so much, I, in good lawyer fashion, sort of refashioned the question in my mind and thought of it as what motivates me to do this work, to work for respect for human rights. And the first thing, of course, that I thought about was my own upbringing, my background, and what factors about my background have led me to where I am today and to this work. And so I thought I'd share a bit about that with you. I was raised in a Christian home, but a very countercultural Christian background. My parents and the community that they were involved with really pushed back against a lot of the hierarchy and the religiosity they saw reflected in various Protestant denominations as well as Catholicism. And they really pushed towards getting together in community, in homes, together to just really get back to the basics of what it might mean to be a follower of Christ, focusing on the fundamentals of personal relationship with God and modeling Christ consciousness and teachings in the world today. And fundamentally, those are to serve the least of these, to reach out to the poor and to the outcast, the oppressed, and the broken. My parents, my community modeled for that for me growing up, and very much a part of my life was practicing serving to those who were less fortunate in our communities, the homeless, elderly, and those less well off. Another factor that motivates me to do this work is my worldview, which obviously has some of its underpinnings in my background and my upbringing. When I step back from the routine of my daily busy life, I'm in awe of the sacredness, the holiness, the beauty, the fundamental goodness that I see around me. I have the sense that we're all interconnected, we're all from the same source, and yet at the same time, just parallel to that reality, I believe, is the reality that we live in a broken world. We live in a place where there's disconnect. Big disconnect in how we treat one another. And so in light of this dichotomy, I've really been puzzled by, why this brokenness and this goodness side by side. And it seems to me as if we've all sort of forgotten at certain points that we all come from the same source. We've forgotten who we are. And so for me, the natural response to observing this in my life is to work for healing, to work for restoration and wholeness. And the way in which I have chosen to do that is by giving my career and profession, focusing it on working for respect for human rights norms. For me, this work flows as worship and action, as an offering working towards justice and right ordering, the kingdom come here and now. Ultimately, engaging in this work for me personally is about coming to know better and to be closer to God and to manifest God and to know God in you, in me, and all around us in the world, to allow spirit and light to flow through, to be a vessel, to be a tool in this work. A third factor that I thought about is a desire that I have, a very strong desire to live life passionately, to live life to the fullest. I think from a very early age, it quickly dawned on me that I'm going to spend a lot of my adult life working. And if I'm going to have to give so many hours of my life to work, I want it to be work that involves something I really care about, that I feel has meaning and a sense of purpose, and allows me to give my best effort to do the best I can, and that motivates me to do that. And working for respect for human rights, I found to be a medium that allows me to do that. Another factor is immense gratitude that I feel day to day in recognizing that being born in this country, one of the wealthier countries in the world where I'm afforded a lot of freedom, I have been given much, and therefore much is required of me. Now, going back to my background, I didn't grow up in a very privileged family. My father's a mechanic. I'm the oldest of 6 children. We were often on the poverty line. We actually lived with food stamps. We relied a lot on the help of others. Nevertheless, relative to the rest of the world, I have been given much. And in fact, to get here today to be a professor at USC, many, many folks along the way helped me, gave me a leg up, supported me in my ambitions and my dreams and my aspirations. And I am indebted to them and grateful for what they have done. I'm very rich, not just in a material sense, but in the sense of the support I have around me through my family, through my community. And it's from that background that I feel it's quite miraculous, really, that I get to do this work. And I feel that I can't squander this generosity, that I must use my life as a response to do good and to likewise give back to those who also are seeking to move forward and engage in what matters to them most. A fifth motivating factor for this work that I'm engaged in has to do with what was referenced in the introduction, and it has to do with a couple of years that I spent living in Africa and having experience working with survivors of mass atrocities, refugees fleeing from countries where they were persecuted. In my work in Africa as a researcher, I witnessed and investigated numerous human rights abuses and extreme suffering firsthand, living in the refugee camps and working in the slums of major cities in East Africa. This research exposed exposed me to things such as child soldier recruitment, beatings and rapes, extreme malnourishment, AIDS, persecution. And I realized that through that work, because of my privileged background, because of who I was, I could come in and actually act as a megaphone or a voice for these individuals, the millions of individuals in East Africa who are often forgotten, ignored, who don't have a voice. In other words, to be a voice for the voiceless. And in having witnessed this suffering firsthand for 2 years, having engaged in in-depth conversations with survivors, sometimes 4 or 5 a day, I realized that I could somehow play a role in helping. Through the research, we were able to write a book that exposed the violations that we witnessed. We were able to set up a legal aid clinic to give refugees and survivors the opportunity to seek out lawyers to advocate on their behalf. We were able to work on a domestic bill in Uganda, pushing for refugee rights at the domestic level and in the legal system. We were able to do things like step in when an Iraqi family was suspended in limbo in Uganda on their way fleeing from Saddam Hussein. And we're able, because of our privileged background, because of our connections, to work with the Canadian ambassador and get them resettled into Canada. We were able to, as researchers, go into a camp and expose deep corruption and abuses that led to the ouster of a camp commander. So I realized that with this background, I could do something. I had to do something after all I had witnessed. And when I left Africa, it was repeated to me over and over again, do not forget us. Do not forget what we have told you. And I feel compelled after having sat and listened to all these individuals and their stories to do something about it. And to try to play a role, and in the words of Steve Jobs, make a small dent in the universe by taking action on behalf of what I'd witnessed. So as a result, now for the past 20 years already, the final factor I want to talk about that motivates me to do human rights work is this quest that I feel that I'm on to actually help realize enforcement of human rights norms, to give them teeth through the law, through legal systems. It's so often considered that human rights are aspirational in nature, that they're merely something we can hope for and wish for. But coming out of Africa, coming from my experience there, I really have the strong desire to work for giving teeth to these norms and realizing their enforcement. So after having worked as a researcher, I was frustrated because while I think that playing a role in documenting abuses was important, raising awareness and exposing and giving a voice, for me, I wanted to be involved and respond even more tangibly. And so that compelled me to law school and grad school as well. And I wanted to learn by learning the law, but also learning about foreign policy, how to realize enforcement of norms found in international law, and how to hold the powerful accountable. So state entities and powerful leaders and individuals that are leading countries and behind some of these abuses. Also, I wanted to learn how I could really proactively, tangibly work for restoration and relief for victims. So with that schooling, I sought out to get as much experience as possible in learning about the best ways to enforce international law. While in law school, I had the opportunity to represent a Tibetan Buddhist monk who was tortured and executed by the People's Republic of China, and with the assistance of the Dalai Lama was fleeing and ended up in San Francisco where I was studying, and I had the most amazing, wonderful honor of working with this individual to get asylum in the United States, and so to work with our immigration system to help victims like him get some sort of protection and relief. I also, as mentioned in the introduction, had the opportunity to learn about teaching and the important role that teaching plays in advocacy and promoting enforcement of human rights. I also got to work with judges at the European Court of Human Rights, which I think is an amazing, from a legal perspective, system for enforcement of human rights norms through the European Convention. Supreme Courts around Europe readily listen to the decisions and consider them binding from the European Court of Human Rights and implement them. And I thought, wow, wouldn't it be so great if the Inter-American court system was equally robust here in our part of the world? And so I wanted to figure out what they were doing well in Europe that we needed to learn from. And then I also had the opportunity to work with arbitrators in an international arbitration process whereby claims were brought, civil claims for reparations by victims who suffered grave human rights abuses during the Ethiopia-Eritrea border conflict, and an arbitration panel was set up to bring about some sort of reconciliation in the aftermath. Eventually, following law school and grad school and those experiences, I was led to, doors opened up for me to go work in The Hague and to work with international criminal tribunals. Now, International criminal tribunals are a bit different in the sense that they hold individuals accountable. They enforce human rights norms through criminal prosecutions rather than, say, in the European Court of Human Rights, where states are held accountable. And through these tribunals, through working in the Rwandan tribunal particularly, I felt like my life had come sort of full circle. Just 10 years earlier, I had been out in the field working with survivors from Rwanda. It was 1996 when I was out there, and the Rwandan genocide was in 94. So I worked directly with many who were impacted by the genocide. And now here I was in The Hague getting to work on cases, prosecuting the prime minister and ministers of the government, the interim government, during the genocide in Rwanda. And I found that these international criminal tribunals were really a wonderful, an important way, I should say, an important way to give some teeth to human rights norms and to enforce them and uphold them. And that through retribution, elimination of impunity, justice could be realized for the victims, but also that these courts, hopefully in the future, and these trials could lead to prevention and deterrence of similar gross human rights violations, as well as peace and reconciliation of societies through this criminal justice process. That's the hope anyway. It's not a perfect system, but it is a response that I think is an important response to human rights abuses, and it's helpful ultimately for enforcement and respect for international norms. In addition to the usual means by which we try to seek enforcement through shaming states and putting pressure on them through exposing violations. So by way of conclusion, I want to make sure we have time for a real dialogue, and you can ask questions and I can respond. I just want to say that being here at USC and teaching and being able to start a human rights clinic 2 years ago is really a dream come true and has allowed for me to through teaching the clinic, through supervising students on real-life cases, which is what we do, and we try to realize justice for victims, and also we work with tribunals on prosecutions. Through this clinical teaching and through my study and scholarship here, I feel that my life has, I've been able to bring these sort of disparate experiences all together in one place. And it also is a continuation of my own quest for seeking for better enforcement of international human rights by hopefully training the next generations of human rights advocates, lawyers, who will use international law as a tool for social justice. In conclusion, this goal that I have, this vision I have for pushing for enforcement of human rights, it's certainly something that takes perseverance, it takes hard work, it takes endless amounts of hope. Change is not always immediate or apparent, but I would just reflect that in my lifetime, the unthinkable has happened, at least with respect to holding heads of state accountable, some of the most powerful individuals behind some of the worst abuses. I'll never forget in law school when Pinochet was extradited, or his extradition was sought. He was arrested in England, and his extradition was sought to stand trial in Spain. And subsequent to Pinochet, we've seen Milosevic and Taylor and al-Bashir and the former Gaddafi and Fujimori and these others being called to task. And I think that's really an important advancement and move forward in enforcement of human rights. For me, because of the sacredness of life and belief in the fundamental goodness of humanity, pushing for respect for human rights for me is imperative, and it's work that I feel very privileged to do. And then in closing, I just want to leave you with two quotes that I've been reflecting on over the last semester in particular in my readings of the Christian mystics. There's a book by Matthew Fox out there. He's collected different excerpts from the Christian mystics, which I have found to be very meaningful and informative and also just refreshing in the work that I do. And so the first quote is, it's a quote that I want to constantly challenge myself in as I pursue what matters to me. And it goes like this: how big am I? How much of the divine life and spirit do I allow to flow in and through me? How much do I experience in me? And the second quote is this: Remember that life is about the awe and the gratitude, the birthing and the creativity, and the compassion, including healing and celebration and justice making that our world so sorely needs. Thank you.
Now we're going to open it up to questions.
You have seen genocide, the Nazi genocide, the Rwandan genocide, the Armenian genocide out of Northern Africa. Is the world sensitive to it? Do we care?
I believe increasingly we do, now more than ever. And there are, at least as in my experience, more individuals now than ever before working to respond. Through efforts such as setting up these tribunals in the 1990s, through efforts on working towards a doctrine in international law that allows for military intervention in some situations to prevent. Most recently in Washington, there's been an intergovernmental body set up on focused specifically on atrocities prevention. We now, we have an ambassador in the State Department, at least in our own country, that focuses on responding to and prevention of atrocities. And we're not alone as a country. There are many countries around the world that have become increasingly focused on this. So I do think we care. I think that the response is better than ever. We have a long way to go. And it won't end until we see the end of genocide, which I'm hopeful for.
Hi, over here.
Hi.
Thank you for an amazing talk, and I was curious how you balance doing so much good in the world and also with your family life and personal relationships, how you are able to balance everything.
That's a great question. I started by saying there are many things that matter to me, and one of those is trying to find that balance. Last night, I chose to have dinner with my husband and do our usual date night, even though I was kind of stressed about today. It's a work in progress. I don't have it all figured out for sure. But I have to say, one of the reasons I'm so grateful to be here at an academic institution like USC is the flexibility that it affords me to be an advocate and a teacher, but also a mom and a wife, and to have a life outside of this work. And many in the field of human rights aren't so lucky to have a place, to have an employer that's so flexible to allow you to juggle those things. And there is, very easily one can get sucked into a savior mentality as a human rights, advocate, such that you feel guilty if you're not doing anything other than reading the latest horrible report coming out of X country about atrocities and abuses. I don't think that's healthy. I don't think that actually being, the savior for everyone out there really makes you an effective advocate, and that starts with taking care of yourself and focusing on your own life and spiritual practice. And so anyway, it's not something I've gotten figured out, but I'm very much focused on trying to find that balance, because I find I'm a much better advocate when I do.
Hi. I'm who you are, and your experiences are very impressive. And
Thank you.
I just wish you the best the world can offer. Okay?
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I'm not exactly sure how to phrase this, and it's kind of a big question, but, and I was brought up Catholic, so you'll hear a little Catholicism in there, but it seems to me that you've observed evil in operation, and I'm wondering if you believe there is such a thing as evil in the world and human evil, or is it mental illness? Is it sociopathic behavior? Is it ignorance? Or Do you think there really is evil in the world? And if so, how do you fight that?
I knew that question was coming. No, it's okay. Well, it's something I struggle with, the whole question of evil, for sure, and struggled with especially when working in Africa and observing and witnessing what I saw and heard about. Yes, I think there's evil, but, the one thing that I think is important to realize is that, we're all capable of it. I think that's the one thing that's important to recognize. And when you hear about the evil folks out there, even Hitler, right, and leaders of the Rwandan genocide, oftentimes there's so much, it's very complicated, and what's going on is there's a lot of rationalizing and justification, and if you and I were in those circumstances, we might do the exact same things, under the circumstances and respond in very similar ways. And so I think that in combating evil, wherever it comes from and whatever is the cause for it, we need to do so with humility and recognition that again, that in the same circumstances we could do so, and that forgiveness is fundamental, and that there's redemption possible, I think, no matter how evil an individual is. That's sort of some random thoughts in response. I don't know if that answers what you're getting at.
Thanks, Professor Garry. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about like restorative justice kind of processes, and you touched on how there's kind of this complex thing behind evil, and that and in my research I've seen that a lot of people who perpetuate evil had evil done to them, and so it's this kind of idea of how do we heal that rather than just punishing and trying to move on. I'm curious what your thoughts are about in terms of like a judicial system.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm a big fan of restorative justice from the little I know of it. One thing that was troubling to me with respect, so restorative justice being the idea you bring together, right, the perpetrator and the victim, and you seek, understanding at least, and reconciliation and forgiveness perhaps. And often a good model of what restorative justice might look like is a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, like Desmond Tutu helped to lead, or just means for making the victim whole, but also allowing that interface, it's my understanding, is with the perpetrator, right? One thing that troubled me in doing the International Criminal Tribunal work, and still does, is that the lack of restorative justice in those processes, and actually sometimes the trials not leading to peace and reconciliation between groups, and actually further dividing groups and feeding into the narrative, the cycle of violence that led to Srebrenica, or led to in the Balkans, or led to the Rwandan genocide. And I think that the international community has realized that this has to be remedied in some way. We don't want these trials to exacerbate situations, and so there's been move towards figuring out how you might have a parallel Truth and Reconciliation Commission process, figuring out how now with the International Criminal Court, the permanent International Criminal Court in The Hague, but also with some of the other courts, the Cambodia Tribunal, there's allowance for victims to participate and to be involved in the proceedings and to actually have their say and to have some interaction and exposure with perpetrators, to seek also compensation, something that, some kinds of reparations that would make them whole. And I think these are good steps, and they're moving in a good direction. It's tricky, though, in balancing the goals of criminal justice and restorative justice, but I think it can be done, and it's a good trending, and I hope we see more of it.
Well, thank you so much for your talk. My
Pleasure.
question really was whether you think that human rights is necessarily an appeal to a universal sense of human rights. So is it necessarily a transcendent value that we have, or is it human rights that are this society's human rights or that society's human rights? And if it's the first, that human rights are actually a universal, transcendent entity, then who is it that determines it, or how do we identify it?
So I lean towards the universal point of view, the transcendent with respect to human rights norms. I certainly think that culture plays into it, and there might be emphasis on different rights across cultures, but there are definitely certain norms and values and beliefs that I think are transcendent, that apply across cultures and people groups. And as to where they come from being human, who we are. This is something we are born with, we're entitled to.
Thank you so much, Hannah, this was a real inspiration for me.
Thank
I
you.
hope we can have more chances to talk to each other about it. There's a theologian at Yale, Miroslav Volf, who once said that those who witness suffering as bystanders are quick to abandon God, but those who actually experience suffering can't help but hold on to God.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like based on the story you told us today, you're somewhere in the middle, that you did experience, but not simply as bystanders, but being part of the community,
Mm-hmm.
and yet perhaps you are not yourself the victim of the actual suffering. My question is, how has that experience affected your view of God and faith, whether it has strengthened or whether you find it challenging, but you're persevering?
A bit of both. Challenged, but then also strengthened in some ways, being in the midst of suffering, not directly perpetrated against, but certainly my dear friends in Africa, watching, I held the hand of one of my friends as he died, and the young boys that I was working with, the unaccompanied minors, orphans, I witnessed them all rounded up firsthand as militias came across the border to take them back to Sudan to fight. And that really rocked and shook me. And I was really struck by the unfairness in the world, and that because of my white skin and because of my nationality, I could leave the refugee camp and I was protected from having to fight. But then, these boys that I'd worked with had to go. And so, it really rocked me. It shook me. At the same time, in the work that I've done, I've seen amazing testament to the human spirit and to individuals in their faith, being able to do such amazing good work in the midst of darkness and violence. The woman who talked about her Catholic background, some of the people I was most impressed by were the Jesuit priests out in Uganda who were operating sort of an underground railroad, if you will, with respect to Hutus who were then being killed systematically as a backlash to the genocide against the Tutsis. And then they're hiding, women and children fleeing from Rwanda and the backlash against them and putting their lives on the line. And it was because of their faith, because of their beliefs. And that it really struck me. I ran into many individuals who, like that, didn't flee or run, but actually stood up and did something about it and put their lives on the line and spoke truth to power, and because of their faith and their belief. And so that strengthened mine as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. You talk about giving teeth to human rights law, and one of the issues with international human rights law is enforcement. I think one of the unique kind of interventions around this was the notion of universal jurisdiction, like Belgium implemented in '93 and then reissued in 2003. What are your thoughts on universal jurisdiction? Is it viable? Is it something that infringes upon the sovereignty of nation states? Is it something that we might see implemented for certain human rights violations in the future?
So thanks for that question. So universal jurisdiction I see as a very important concept. So universal jurisdiction is the idea that any national court out there could try cases, often criminal in nature, but and hear cases that involve abrogation of certain human rights norms without really having any link to the crime or to the fact pattern. Traditionally, national courts will hear a case because it happened on their territory or it happened to one of their nationals. They have some kind of link to the case that gives them justification for exerting adjudicatory power over the situation. But with universal jurisdiction, the idea is any court out there anywhere could hear these cases, and it's simply because of the nature of the violation at issue. I think universal jurisdiction is an important concept for some of the most serious human rights abuses, what we call the core international crimes of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. The problem, though, is in the exercising of that power, it often becomes politicized. And the ability of certain states to even hear these cases is questionable, to have fair trials, to have fair processes, because they don't, if there's no attachment to the case whatsoever, they don't have ready access to the evidence that's required, and et cetera, for even holding a fair trial if you're thinking about a criminal case. Nevertheless, I think it's an important concept. I think it's not something that my own personal view is not something that should be applied to all sorts of human rights abuses, but the worst of the worst. And there's increased, because of the International Criminal Court system, and that we have now 121 states out of 192 or so that have signed on. And under that system, there is the requirement that all states parties do hear these cases, almost a sort of universal jurisdiction framework that's being set up. And I think that's important because we're, for the worst of the worst, these human rights abuses, genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, it's really important to close the gaps and the loopholes that exist, such that, future genocidaires can't escape justice, no matter where they go, what country they travel to, they could potentially be held liable. And I think, there's an important advancement under the International Criminal Court and the complementarity principle that allows for most states around the world to actually hear these cases in their own courts.
Professor Garry, I was just curious, as far as any personal examples of dangerous situations you've faced, and how have you gotten yourself out of those? Because, you're obviously constantly being placed in very dangerous areas.
Yeah. I was 21 when I did that work, and I think I believed I was invincible. I thought I was just protected. I didn't, I almost went across the border into Sudan to meet some of the rebel leaders, because I just thought, I'm got to get this information, I got to document this, et cetera, et cetera. And now when I look back at it, I was in a lot of risky situations that I should have realized ahead of time could have led to really grave consequences. And I really do feel like I had so many angels along the way that just kind of looked out for me and saw this very idealistic, trying to do good white girl, tromping around the country, and they just sort of kind of tried to guide me and tried to keep me, away from certain situations. And I really am so grateful and so thankful. And today, if I were to, I couldn't imagine going out and doing some of those things. And there just wasn't, I guess the answer is there wasn't a lot of necessarily thought that went into it. And I just trusted that I was going to be safe. And it did work out that way. And I'm really grateful. But I think in hindsight, I probably would have, spent more time thinking about that. I was very fortunate to be working with some very established institutions in these countries. And so, often I was, whenever I went to refugee camps, I went with some sort of entourage under the auspices of the United Nations with various humanitarian aid groups. And, I was a little naive and idealistic, but I also did have some sense of what I needed to do, and I tried to do it. And then I just had, again, a lot of local folks who were really, I think, touched and inspired that I cared, to come out and live in Africa and be with them and really try to understand what they were experiencing. The question that we were asking in our research project in Africa was, all right, great. So there's this Refugee Convention, there's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there's all these treaties. So how does that play out in the life of the everyday life of a refugee in East Africa? Do they realize these norms? That was my basic question. I wasn't a lawyer. I just wanted to know. It's like, so what does international law do for the person on the ground? And that's what I was trying to understand and document. And I think people really responded to that. They also wanted to help me find those answers.
Thank you for coming today, Professor Garry.
Thank you.
So when you're dealing with a client on a human rights case, or you become very emotionally invested with them and you have a bond with them, how do you deal with the situation where it's impossible to come out with a good outcome, and it's kind of a failure on your part?
That's a good question. Well, in dealing with clients individually, and I'm thinking of, especially, again, going back to my Africa experience, and I had so many people coming to me and wanting representation or assistance in various ways and help. And I knew that it was just beyond my capacity and power to do, and I would always try to set expectations that, I will do my best and try to do the best that I can, but know that, there are certain forces beyond my capacity to control that determine the outcome here. And I guess that for me personally and emotionally, I always try to engage in those relationships by setting expectations accordingly, but then also giving myself the space and the freedom to realize and understand that I'm human and I do the best that I can. And after that, it's all I can give, and I'm not superhuman. I'm not a superhero, as my son is so enamored with at the moment. And that as long as I've done my best, that's I have to let it go at that. Well, thank you all very much. I really enjoyed this time with you.
At this time, we're going to wrap it up, just because I know students have class, so we want to respect your schedules. But firstly, thank you all for coming out and sharing in this space with us that Professor Garry so graciously created. We thank you for engaging, and I hope that you come away feeling inspired and refreshed. And we thank you, Professor Garry, for sharing so openly and so honestly with us. And as a token of appreciation, the student committee would like to present this journal, this lovely journal with a quote, and we hope that you will use it to record and reflect on what matters to you and why.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you. I think that's awesome. Have a great day. Thank you.